Hi, everyone. We will get started. My name is Shiza Fareed, and I'm a data analyst with the FP 2030 team, and I'll be moderating today's panel on developing new measures in family planning. We originally had 4 speakers, but due to unexpected changes, we have the 2 panelists who will be presenting their findings today. Our first speaker is Emily Sonneveld. She is the Director of Monitoring and Evaluation and Advocacy for Avenir Health, and she is also the Director of the Track 20 project. She focuses on expanded use of data for monitoring and strategic decision-making. And our final speaker will be Noor Houraneh. She is the Assistant Professor of Public Health and Policy at King Saud University in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. She is also the Honorary Fellow at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She was a co-principal investigator on a project assessing ethical challenges in family planning community in Francophone West Africa. She will be presenting these findings. So we'll hear from Emily first, and then Noor, and then we'll open it up for questions.
All right, let's see. This one is working out as well? Okay. All right, a little bit of an angle to see the slides, but we'll do the best we can here. Okay, so thank you, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. And before I get started, I want to acknowledge that I'm actually presenting this on behalf of a pretty big team, some of which took really important leadership roles in the process of this re-estimation. So specifically, I'd like to point out 2 people that are listed here at the top that you can see. So we have Elena Lebetkin and also Marcus Steiner of FHI 360 who took the lead. And then we have 2 people that well, there's a lot of people that helped, but other 2 sort of main ones from USAID that we have are Fatou Jallo and, of course, Abeni Salem, who many of us know. So I want to be really clear that they played a very large role in this, and I'm simply here presenting the work that the group did. Okay. So I'm going to spend some time talking about a new update that was done for CYPs, or a couple years of protection. So I'm going to talk about, okay, can I hold something and move? Because it is really hard to not be able to see the slides. Can I see yours?
Yeah.
Okay, great. That one I think is solid.
Do you want me to do that?
Okay. Yeah, could you do that? Thank you. Oh, that's so much easier to be able to see the slides while I'm speaking. Okay, so apologies for that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this recent update that was done, the process that was taken to do the update, and then the big reveal at the end is the evidence and the final calculations of the new CYP factors for those updates. Next, Shiza. Okay, I'm assuming that many of you know what CYP is. Does anybody here use CYP in their work? You calculate, use the factors? Anyone? Okay, a few of you. Okay, so for those of you who do, you're very familiar with the definition, but for those of you who don't, just to give an idea, CYP is a couple years of protection, and it's the estimated protection that's provided by providing family planning methods during a 1-year period. And really important distinction is that it's based on the contraceptives that are handed out to actual clients, so that sort of distribution lower level, not based on calculated for those that are purchased to bring into a country. Although you do see that happening, that's not the purpose of CYPs. The purpose of CYPs is to be that last level distribution mark. Next slide. All right, so one of the update that happened recently for CYPs included a really nice advancement that we hadn't done for the past updates that happened. And that's actually creating a framework for when an update is needed. And this was really led by FHI 360, by Marcus Steiner, who sort of jumped in and decided that we needed to have some sort of decision process that was transparent for whenever we actually needed to have an update. So what was decided was if a method fell into either of these 3 buckets, then a review should be done to decide if an update is necessary. So the first one is if the method is new or newly available within low and middle income countries, there isn't an existing CYP, so that one's obvious, we need one. For the second one, if you have a label change in terms of duration of use, and that label change has been validated by a regulatory body. So if that happens, we need to do a review. And then the third one if the actual presentation or packaging of a method has changed, and that impacts how much or the quantity of a method that clients are getting, then you then also need to do a review for an update of CYP. Next slide. So if a method falls into any of those three buckets, what does that mean? So if you fall into the first bucket where it's new, you need a new one, or you need a first one. And we're going to look at the existing methodology for other methods and see how we can adapt that for that new method. For the second and third, the labeled duration of use, so if it's just a change in the duration, then we're just going to change part of the calculation for the CYP to align with that new bit of information and make the change, but the rest of the calculation stays the same. And for the third one, if there's a presentation change as well, that presentation change means that the quantity is different. So again, it's changing that part of the calculation that's related to that specific modification, but the rest of the calculations will stay the same, right? So that's sort of how that's going to work. Next one. So here's the interesting thing. So when we did this recent review, how many methods fell into those three buckets? 5, which means that 5 of the methods went through the process of reviewing to see if we needed to either create or amend an existing CYP. All of the other methods were not changed or modified. We didn't look into them. So for the first bucket, we had 2 methods that were newly available, the Kaya Diaphragm and the levonorgestrel for pericoital use, which I'm just going to call pericoital contraception as we move forward. The second one, the labeled duration of use change, we have Levoplant, which was originally called Sino Implant, for those of you who have worked in that area, and then the Hormonal IUD. And then the third one, third bucket, there's one method that fell into that category, and that was the USAID supplied progesterone-only pills, or POPs, where they switched the number of pills included in the procured packs, right? So those were those differences. So we're just going to go through those 5 methods really quickly so that you can see the type of information that was newly available and understand how those calculations were produced or modified to end up at the newly released updated CYP factors. So I'm sure many of you know there's really 2 types of diaphragms. We have our fitted ones that come in multiple sizes and require a fitting with a provider. And then the new sort of advancement of the Kaya diaphragm is that it's a single size fits most. So it's a less complicated process in terms of initiating use of the diaphragm. So back when the 2000 round of CYP updates was being done, there was very little information that was available on diaphragms and continuation of use. And so with very little information, a lot of the estimation actually depended kind of on expert opinion. And so there were 3 people leading that process. It was John Stover, Jane Bertrand, and Jim Shelton, who led that, any of you who know them. And the real best educated guess we could come up with was 1 CYP per diaphragm. That was sort of the educated guess. So when the 2011 review was done, and that review was led by me, the diaphragm was sort of left out and kind of taken off of the list because it was so underutilized that it wasn't really carried forward. So we kind of didn't review it at all. We just let it sort of disappear. So for the most recent update, there was another review that went, and they actually did find one article from 2001, the study that was done in Colombia, the Philippines, and Turkey, which estimated about a 57% continuation at 12 months. That was available. And then looking at the new data related to the Kaya diaphragm, there was really just one study that was available coming out of Niger, which estimated about an 84% 6-month continuation rate. You can see that those are pretty different, right? Those are pretty different. Continue on. But because we're really talking about 2 studies, and each of them done using a different type of the method, what was sort of decided during this process is that we would just continue with the 1 CYP, but add diaphragm back to the list, so sort of revitalize it to get a little bit more visibility. And the 1 CYP would apply to either the older or the newer Kaya diaphragm moving forward. So you'll see that addition to the CYP table. So the second one, that pericoital contraception, so this was included because of there was some emerging evidence through research and also, as I'm sure you guys know, a lot of anecdotal conversation that people were using off-brand uses of emergency contraception and using it pericoitally. So using it both before and after sexual activity to try to prevent pregnancy. So thinking of it from that perspective, it was thought that it would be a good idea to try to bring that into the discussion, that type of off-brand use of EC, and give a CYP factor to pericoital contraception as well. So for this case, there were two studies. The first one by Feston et al. Found that the average monthly use in terms of number of pills was about 4.8, and that the effectiveness associated with that was about 93% effective. So pretty good. There's a second study that's done by Canberra Collective in Ghana. So this study is actually not publicly available, but it's almost publicly available. But Canberra was really nice to share the key data points that we needed to be able to make the CYP estimates at the time. I think it's going to come out next month or something, so it's almost there. And so what they found in their findings was about 1.7 average monthly number of pills per month, and that their effectiveness was about 98%, right? So also pretty high. So although it's not a lot of evidence, it's some, and it's a start in an area where we see sort of increasing use. So a weighted average was simply taking of those two studies, and those numbers are across the bottom. Next slide. And so we decided to sort of adapt the CYP calculation that's used for oral contraceptive pills to account for pericoital. This is the same approach that's used for EC. EC has had a CYP factor specifically for emergency contraceptive use, and it's an adapted calculation based on the oral contraceptives. So you see here that it took that average that was at the bottom of the previous slide, and you take the average number of pills per month times the 12 months to cover the year, because remember CYP is an annual indicator. And then it just divides it by that average effectiveness rate, which gives you the 31 pills per CYP. For ease of use and comprehensive, it's rounded to 30. So you can see sort of that on the right-hand side. And then, go back for 1 second, you can also flip it if you want, and the 0.033 CYP per pill. So depending on how you're running your programs, depends on which of those numbers might be the best use for you. All right, so now we're going to move into the second category, which are the methods that have a change in duration of use, right, from that decision tree at the beginning. So the first one is the Levo plant. Again, this is the Sino implant. So this was initially registered in 1994 as a 4-year product. So in 2017, WHO changed that and pre-qualified it as a 3-year product based on a study that found that there were significantly higher rates of pregnancy in that 4th year of use, right? But the first 3 were still relatively well protected. So currently, that is now registered as a 3-year product. So that shift has happened. So in this case, we're pretty lucky because we already had implants that lasted 3, 4, and 5 years, right? We have Implanon, which was 3, we had Sino, which had been 4, and then we have Jadel? Jadel, that's 5. And so we didn't really need to do anything here except for use the 3-year duration CYP factor that was already available for Implanon here, right? So a change, but not one that required any calculations. They were already finished. Okay, so then the second method that had a change in duration of use, this one's interesting. This is the most interesting method of the update, is related to the hormonal IUD. And so for this one, a literature review was done, and it was done because the FDA extended duration of use from 5 to 7 years for Mirena. Now, in August, it was actually extended to 8, but this was done before that. So keep your eyes open for potentially another change that's coming. And it's anticipated that the national drug regulatory authorities in the low and middle income countries will also follow suit. Now, whether they follow suit to 7 or 8, we're going to have to stay tuned since this seems to be a bit of a moving space. But so when this review was being done, we found a few studies that actually were looking at hormonal IUDs. None of those existed during the last 2 updates. So when the one that was done in 2001 and the one that was done in 2011, it was assumed that copper T and hormonal IUDs were the same because we didn't have any evidence that told us differently. So IUDs were simply estimated as a whole. But during this most recent review, there actually was some information that told us maybe that assumption was not the best assumption. So you can see that through the top two lines here. You have a choice study and a LEAP study. And what you see here is that for the first year, hormonal IUDs had a higher continuation rate compared to copper in both of those studies. Now, the first one, the choice study, continued on, and that relationship sort of continued until it evened out in about year 3. We do have another study done by Chow in China, which studied hormonal IUD, but they didn't also study the copper T, so we couldn't do that comparison, although that 93 is in line with the first two studies, so that's fine. We do have a bit of an outlier, which is the last one, Rao, where you see a bit of an opposite relationship, but there's some question in regard to this study for a few reasons. One is it started back in 1993, so counseling protocols have changed. So they've done some comparisons between how counseling was done back in 93 compared to now, and researchers aren't sure that the continuation rates from that far back are comparable to the newer studies. So just in transparency, that is a bit of an outlier for what we've seen, but we think we understand why that might be happening. Okay, so because before we modeled the two IUDs together, we thought that this evidence justifies that we should change that approach, that we should actually model the copper T IUD separately from the hormonal IUD. And when we started to look at the hormonal IUD, although we only have a little bit of data, right? Really those two studies that are letting us understand the comparison between the two, it was enough to let us know that we need to think of a different option. So interestingly, when you compare the continuation rates for the hormonal IUDs, they're almost exactly the same as continuation rates for implants. Almost exact. So because of that, we decided to use the continuation curves for the implants for the hormonal IUDs. So we did that to be able to calculate their own CYP factor. So now on the USAID website, what you'll notice is that there's two IUD factors, one for hormonal and one for the typical copper IUD. They're not the same. And hopefully you can guess from the slides is that the hormonal is just a bit higher. Their CYP factor is a bit higher. Okay, so now we get into that third and final category, which is what do we do when packaging is different? So for this one, USAID previously procured progesterone-only pills in 28-day packets, but that's changing to be procured to 35-day packets. So that is a significant enough change that we need to actually put that new number into the CYP calculations to make sure that we update the CYP factor for this method. So it's a pretty simple calculation. You take the number of pills that you need for the year and then divide it by that effectiveness. You see the calculation here. So it comes out to be about 11.2. But again, in terms of rounding, we went to 12. So one of the things in CYP that the upward rounding is expected to cover is some degree of wastage. There's actually not enough research for us to be able to determine how much wastage there is. So instead of trying to be overly determinative about something that we have very little data on, we do a rounding and hope that that helps to cover some of it. But at least it's consistent. So that's new. So here we go is the final new updated table that's available on the USAID website as well as the D4I website. And the ones that are in orange are the ones that are new. The other ones are ones that hopefully you already know and use on a regular basis. But this gives us an idea of what we should be changing in our calculations as we work in our countries. And then just a few links that I encourage you to look at. So that's, hopefully everybody already has saved on their computer how to get to the CYP factors. But D4I also has a really great indicator database, and that has a lot of other indicators that will be of interest to you as well, as including the new updated CYP, and then a brief write-up that's available from the FHI 360 website that talks about this process. It gives a lot more detail than I just did. So excellent. Thank you very much. No, okay, I'm gonna give this to you.
All right. All right. Do you want to, okay. Your notes are okay.
You can see the Yeah. And I think you can even make it bigger if you want. Oh, yeah, perfect.
Oh, that's, you don't have to start using it.
Yeah, okay. I don't need it. It's fine.
You don't need it? Okay.
I think so. Okay. You can hear me, right? Okay, perfect. Well, I'll be presenting something quite different than our previous presentation. It's more of a qualitative analysis, which is going to be, I don't know if it's going to be less or more interesting. I feel like it's a lot to follow up from, so thank you for the previous presentation. So I will be presenting, my talk is under the name of Are We Measuring What's Right in Family Planning? So this is part of a qualitative study that I was part of, and it was part of a bigger, much larger project with Dr. Ben Shislagi from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine alongside these beautiful ladies at the front row. And I'll be presenting some of the results from this study. Okay. So I know I'm presenting to a group of experts from family planning, but it's okay to go over a few basic concepts. As you all know, family planning is not a modern concept. Throughout ancient times, people have been interested in fertility, having fertility gods, trying to increase having children or decrease having kids or space them out. One of the earliest documentations of the medicalization of family planning was in ancient Egypt in the Ebers Papyrus, almost 1,500 years before Christ, and this provided some recipes for contraception. Another nice example that I find super interesting was during the Golden Islamic era, and this is Ibn Sina or Avicenna, and he was a famous Persian polymath. He was a philosopher, he was a physicist, a mathematician, a physician, and an astronomer, and he's actually perceived as the father of modern medicine. He's written the Canon of Medicine, and in it there are multiple, again, recipes of contraceptive ways, including coitus interruptus, and this was widely accepted and practiced since in Islamic religion it is accepted to use contraception for family planning within marriage. Yet, more modern times, family planning became an organized kind of programs, and this started kind of in the 1950s, where there was interest in demography and the worry of overpopulation. So a lot of it was influenced by Malthusianism. And during the 60s, this is when we started looking at the invention of unmet needs, I think, and measurements of unmet need, and insistence on measuring uptake of contraception. In the 1970s, this was the surge of women's rights activism. This was the surge as well of gender equality. And as well in 1971, this is when, the UNFPA was founded. And more movement, happened in the 1980s and the 1990s, which led to the 1994 Cairo conference, the ICPD Cairo conference, which was an extremely important turning point since there was a shift from the narrative of demography into a rights-based narrative, which led us to the 2012 London Summit, which led to the FP 2020 with a target to increase contraception use or family planning users by additional 120 million women, which again led us to FP 2030, where the narrative has now changing even more to focus more on women's rights and human rights. Yet, what measurements are we using? And I feel like there's a lot of talk about the insistence of using quantitative indicators that measure uptake of contraception. So the larger project was called Reimagining Family Planning Norms to Amplify Women's Voices in Francophone West Africa, and the main aim was to identify ethical challenges nested in the family planning community and increase women's voices within the community. And this was a really big project that was made up of different layers. The first one was kind of to look or assess ethical issues from a global perspective. This is where we interviewed different global advocates. The second one was the funding stream. We have some people in the room that will be presenting on it tomorrow, where we looked at the top funders for family planning programs in Francophone West Africa and saw the narrative they use to describe their programs and how they measure it in real life. The third one was the implementation layer. This is when we interviewed people on the ground within the family planning community in Francophone West Africa to assess some of the ethical challenges they face. And then the last one was the field experience, where we interviewed men and women, both users and non-users of family planning, but the ones that are exposed to family planning programs and seeing things from their perspective. So what I'll be presenting is the first layer, where we interviewed different global advocates from all over the world, from the global north and the global south, even though I don't like the description of that, but for the sake of this presentation, I'll stick to it. So the smaller project objectives was basically to explore the views of global advocates on the relationship between sexual and reproductive health targets and women's empowerment, ethical challenges in current family planning programs from the targets, the incentives, the indicators, and the application on the ground. The third is to explore their views on the strategies that increase women's representation in the design and implementation of different family planning interventions. And the last is to explore their views on the role that social and gender norms play in women's access and interest in family planning services. The methods, this was a qualitative study where we conducted semi-structured interviews with different global advocates. There were 31 in total, and they were classified into different groups. We interviewed NGO workers, government officials, advocates, funding agency officials, in addition to academics. We applied a thematic analysis. So some of the emerging themes from the project, although I'm not going to be presenting all of them, I'm choosing just specific ones. But some of the emerging themes were social norms of the family planning community and the systems of targets and incentives. We also talked about, or we saw a lot of talk on success indicators, should they or should they not be used, and the views on them. We also found there was a lot of talk on the roles of men, women, couples in the reproductive decision-making process, as well as the conceptualization of agency and what it means to different people. The last thing is the clash of local and international values and the implicit risks of cultural imperialism. When it came to the role of men, it was really interesting, and I know this goes beyond my talk, but just to give you a little glimpse of it, some people believe that just like women have their reproductive rights, men as well have reproductive rights, and they have every right to decide when and how many children they want and with who they want it. Others, on the other hand, saw that, there are obstacles, and so they have no say in what women's choices are. And then the majority kind of fell in the middle, but they, again, either saw men as people to help make the decision, or they should be used, and so they were perceived as catalysts that should be used in order for women to make their decisions. I can talk more about this after, if anybody's interested in this. But in my talk, I'll be focusing on the indicators and the success indicators. Most of the interviewees that we asked what do they think of success indicators mostly focus on unmet need and contraceptive prevalence rate. And these opinions varied. So opinions fell on a spectrum and varied by professional background and personal experiences. Some people said, I think unmet need is a great indicator. So it kind of fell between great, horrible, and in the middle. And again, people in the middle were the majority of maybe it's a good starting point, it gives you a good estimate of what's happening on the ground, and it kind of also gives you a common language between the funders, the policymakers, and the implementers on the ground. But it does not provide a complete picture. And this official at the funding agency said it can't be the only thing that you are looking at. So the challenges that we found when people were talking about indicators fell into 4 different groups. So we're looking at challenges with current indicators, challenges in coming up or designing and implementing new indicators, and then there was these challenges with the global local tension and the decolonizing narrative, and then there were also challenges within the women-centered issues. So when it came to current indicators, when we asked people about their views about what do you think about these new indicators, some actually told us that there are some limitations in the calculations. And again, this comes back to it doesn't give you the full, clear picture. And then they told us as well that it might provide room for coercive practices, and this has been seen in history. But it also told us that you can promote LARCs over other forms of contraception. And this specific advocate told us that we know the target has led to more attention to the insertion of LARCs rather than the removal, because the target won't capture anything about the comprehensive kind of removal part of the services. And this is what they were worried about, is that focusing on uptake rather than what happens after the uptake was an issue. And they were also worried about it being the main driver for funding. And this actually came from a funding agency official saying that I don't want the indicator to drive the conversation and drive the policy. Family planning is not the same as an infectious disease, but it is treated as one. when we asked them about designing new indicators, most people told us that they need qualitative measurements to actually measure satisfaction and measure some things about autonomy and choice, as well as take context into account. But I don't like to call it a cliche, but it was a repetitive answer of there aren't any good indicators that measure autonomy or measure choice. Although the more I spent time in this conference, the more I know there are actually some good indicators. But it's just interesting that they see them as difficult. And there was also these philosophical discussions that occurred of what is choice, and is there truly like a free choice? Do women actually do what they want, or are they influenced by their communities, by their marriages, by their in-laws, by their religion, by their healthcare provider, and even the system that they are in? The second thing was, a few people told us that there might be resistance from the older demographers, and the fact that they're really trying hard to hold on to the legacy that they brought into this field. The third thing was pressure from big organizations to showcase easy to collect measurable outcomes. So this is a bit of a long quote, but I'll read it out. So this is again from a funding agency official, and she was saying that the funders are convinced with the smaller research findings, which usually talk about normative change, that they say so. These interventions are multifaceted and complex, and they say, show me what you can do at a scale and what you can measure it at a scale, which we haven't yet been doing. But can you measure it as easily as you can measure contraception prevalence rate and etc. in these big surveys? Because that's another hassle. And then she says that you don't have strong evidence, but on the other hand, they don't fund enough to collect evidence. So there's this bit of a tension between actually having, what do you do with the evidence that you find through research, and how do you apply it in real life? When it came to the decolonizing narrative, there was a lot of tension, there's a lot of frustration, so I'm just going to read out some quotes to kind of showcase some of the issues that people were thinking about. So somebody from a funding agency said, there's perceived wisdom in the family planning community that all these women are having babies without their will. I'm not sure. So it showcases that there's not understanding of what's happening in real life on the ground. Another academic was saying, how are you making decisions from Washington, D.C. about very complex and diverse places and countries? And then I also talked about some of the influences, again, in big funding agencies and in big family planning communities when it came to Western views, let's say. So, is that even a rights-based part? It comes from a kind of antiquated traditional approach that I find wholly insufficient. It is literally mostly American white women in their 60s who define what that rights-based approach should look like. And then another person actually came up with a similar view and saying, it's white feminism, definitely. Peak white feminism. It's very much like this sort of peak white feminism. So this was a shared frustration by a few people about some of the legacy and maybe the misunderstanding between what's happening at the top levels and on the bottom ones. When it came to women-related issues, a lot of people also raised the concern of fertility desires are not dichotomous. And a lot of times they are treated as such. And many of the people that we interviewed actually reflected on their own personal lives and said how their fertility desires changed over time, depending on the context, the partner, the age, and so on. This academic was saying, there shouldn't be a tension between women's rights and family planning, but in practice there is. Another one was telling us women are looked at with a binary lens when it comes to contraception, but it's much more complex than user and non-user. We need measuring tools. I'm really sorry, but it's really small. Okay. We need measuring tools to allow you to have an idea of context to women's stories and what agency actually means. And there was a lot of talks in this conference about what agency actually means and how different it is in different contexts and the difficulties in measuring agency. But it always came back to the donor. And I think the general frustration with a lot of people was the influence of donors. There's no room for critical conversation between donors, NGOs, governments, because everyone wants to talk or accommodate the donors. And they kept telling us that whatever the money comes and whatever they ask us to do, we will do. And we even raised concerns with some of the culture maybe of medical practice and how people were thinking, as long as I'm providing this for my patient, then it must be the best service that I can provide, because this is what the funding agency is telling me to do. And so that was a clash as well in that practice. In summary, the views of current indicators was kind of between eradicating them, modifying them, or continuing the use of them. There was agreement that they're useful in assessing progress, but they might lead to coercion. When it came to limitations of current indicators or limitations in calculations, yet they were easy to monitor. And there was also a demography legacy. And when it came to new indicators, there's difficulty in assessing choice and autonomy. In order to move forward, there was a need to address colonial influences and the legacy, as well as the promotion of qualitative measures. The last thing is the acknowledging of the influence of donor narrative on practice in real life. Thank you.
Is this one on? All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Noor and Emily. I think we can now turn to questions. So we will take a few questions at a time. Does anybody have a question for either of our speakers? They were great presentations. So. Maybe I'll kick us off with a question for both of you, and then if others have them, we can continue. Emily, I was interested in your presentation about the CYP updates, and could you just talk a little bit about how these updates are going to be socialized for programmatic work? Is USA taking that work forward? Is it FHI 360? And then Noor, I would be curious, your presentation was fascinating, and I'm so happy there was some qualitative findings. This is the first session I've attended where there were qualitative research shown, so thank you for that. Could you share a little bit about the geographic makeup of the interviews that you held? So I'll just turn it over to both of you.
I think mine might be pretty easy in terms of dissemination. So it's not quite there yet. It's been done for a couple months, and there's been some initial dissemination. There was internal webinars at USAID to make sure that country offices were updated. And we're in the process now of collaborating with FP 2030 to have a larger dissemination to make sure that they're sort of available for everybody across the board. And then obviously within projects and programs, documentation is being provided to make sure that their monitoring and evaluation have the most updated numbers. So it's sort of ongoing. And if anybody has any ideas or suggestions, we'd be happy to do some collaborations on dissemination if you think it would be useful within your networks to have something very specifically directed. Let us know. I think everybody on board is pretty flexible in trying to make that happen.
Perfect. Thank you. And then for the geographical location of the participants, right? So I do want to remind you, these are people in power and powerful positions regardless of where they are. But we interviewed people from South America, the States, Europe, Francophone West Africa, India. But again, like funding agencies were top officials within either the corporate or in the regional offices. And then it was the government officials that mostly came from Francophone West African countries. And academics, again, spanned we interviewed academics from Francophone West Africa, Europe, and the States, as well as a few countries in South America. Yeah, that was mostly it.
Thank you. Are there any other? Oh, I see a question. Is there a hand mic that we can give to the people asking questions? Huh?
Thank you very much. This question is for Emily, and thank you for the very clear explanation of the processes and all that was involved in coming up with the revision of the CYP. So the question for you is just to try to gather from your experience in the field, because there's some movement against CYP, people arguing that it's being misused for monitoring, and there's a lot of maybe inflation going on in the field. So from your experience in tracking FP 2020 and CYP and all your intersection with the country government and all the pros and cons, please give us some idea what you are finding, and if there's a way to better use the indicator, or if you have a suggestion about how to modify it or discard it. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Jacob. I'll leave it to you to ask the hard question. So, yeah, there is controversy around CYP, and I definitely find that it falls into a couple buckets. And Janine actually could probably talk to it as much as I can there in the back. So, countries all use CYP and have forever, and they kind of quietly do it behind the scenes. And they're continuing to do it. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of controversy internalized to government reporting. And so the one core indicator that's part of the FP 2030 framework, which is the CYPs coming from countries' HMIS systems, pretty non-controversial, pretty much aligned with how governments are using the information. And of course, also that internal reporting through the USAID systems that has happened forever, having CYP being one of their core indicators. I think where the controversy comes from is when people try to use CYP for things it wasn't intended to be used for. So to try to automatically put it into a rate or to try to sort of calculate some sort of prevalence using CYP. And there's a lot of people that do that. And I'll admit that I do it too sometimes. So, but mostly internally to try to have some understanding. So I think a lot of the kickback we get is when people see things presented that CYP is sort of being leveraged outside of the norm. So I find that most of the controversy sits in that space, not in the nuts and bolts monitoring that seems to be happening in countries and within donors. But with that said, I do think that there's a need, and I think the reason why there's this controversy is that CYP is not it's not an inherently easy indicator to understand, right? So if we've provided 10,000 years of protection, people don't really understand how to use that on a practical basis, which is why they try to transform it, right? So you can kind of see the motivation. So I'm not sure that there's a ready answer for that, because I think transforming CYP is problematic, but finding other indicators that are able to sort of complement what that means is probably where we want to live. But if we think back to, CYP was developed because we needed something comparable across countries. We needed something that we could actually just look at is more happening here compared to here. And there's planning reasons for that, right? I mean, we need it for planning reasons. So I think if we stick in that box, it's okay, but it's unsatisfactory for people, which is why they push outside that box. So not sure that's the most helpful answer, but I think within all the controversy, I don't like to forget the fact that it's quietly being used every month, every year by countries everywhere, and by the donors that it reports to that aren't transforming it into something that it shouldn't be, but using it for their own internal planning purposes, and it seems to function quite nicely for that. And maybe we need to just let it live in that space instead of trying to push it into a space where dialogue happens in more complex discussions, because that's where I think people become dissatisfied.
Thank you, Emily. Other questions? We'll take a few. All right. So why don't we start with, I think, the woman in the scarf here, and then we'll take another one.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Emil, for sharing the CYP factor. My question is, according to the definition of CYP, why are we including emergency contraceptives in the CYP, while we know that emergency contraceptives is not a routine family planning method?
Thank you. We'll take all of them, and then we'll turn it over.
Thank you again for the two great presentations. My question goes to the lady at the middle. Great presentation, thought-provoking kind of presentation. Regarding the indicators, the rule of thumb is come up with indicators that you can measure, their means of verification and everything. I quite agree with you relating to qualitative indicators. They tell a better story. But have you thought about how these indicators can be collected, measured, verified, and things like that? Because at the end, don't come up with indicators that you cannot measure and verify. So that is the question to you. But I quite agree, we need to know more about autonomy, choices, and things like that. Thanks.
Thank you. Both presentations are really great and both are informative and yeah, awesome. I have two questions, one question for each speaker. The first question to the first speaker, how do you calculate the CYP for DMPSC because it is also the new project, especially if the woman do self-injection? Is it the same as DMPIM or DMPSC provider administration? Or my second question is to the second presenter. Okay, which type of new indicator would you like to suggest? Do you have any new indicator in your mind? Can you give us some examples? Thank you.
Great. Emily, do you want to start first and then Noor?
Okay, so I'll start with the EC question. So this is a little bit of an interesting topic, right? Whether or not EC should be included as a woman who uses EC, whether or not she's calculated as a current user or not a current user. And we know that they're often very undercounted. They're not being captured in traditional reporting systems. But in reality, what EC does is provide protection from pregnancy. So it provides protection for a specific period of time. And so with that in mind, it has a CYP factor because it serves the same purpose as the other methods that are being used to be calculated. It's not as long, right? Your protection is much more limited, but it is a defined period of protection. So by distributing and taking EC, you're not going to get pregnant for that period of time, meaning that you have been provided protection. Now, that's why the CYP factor is big, because it takes a lot of that protection to give you a year of protection, but in essence, it functions the same as other methods in terms of its purpose. So that's why it was included, and especially the inclusion of the pericoital is because we're now finding that women are using sort of off-brand usage by taking it before sex as well as after having sex, and so it's becoming more normalized as something that's happening periodically. And so if that's happening, it's really important to understand the amount of protection in a community being provided from that method as well. So it's sort of an evolving discussion, but the fact that it's providing protection means that it needs to be included in the CYP factors, even with all the other discussions that are happening. So interesting question about self-injection. So self-injection would fall into that third bucket of changes that we talked about. However, the change that's made from DMPS to self-injection is only a packaging and distribution change in the mechanism. The underlying protection provided does not change. So the CYP factors are the same. So you don't need two ones for whether or not it's the intramuscular versus the self-injection or even just the subcutaneous. All of them have the same sort of biological mechanism or protection mechanism behind it. It's only the distribution mechanism that's different. So those are the same.
All right, and I'm stuck with the very difficult questions.
Yes.
Okay, how do I want to answer this? This is it was started as an exploration of different views. Sorry, you were the one who asked the question, right? Exploration of different views about what is happening. We wanted to kind of just open up the conversation and see what's happening on the ground. I completely understand that you can't preach for something if you don't have solutions, but there have been a few academics. So I think there's a talk tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, by Lee Senderowitz, and she has developed something about contraceptive autonomy, and she has been trying to push for new forms of measurements. Now the thing is, I think it might take quite some time because you need to come up with these measurements and then measure them qualitatively, understand the different contexts and how they are even understood by different people. So I remember one of the one of the people that we interviewed was saying how we want men to be involved in the decision-making process. We want men to be part of, coming into the clinic. Then she said, some of the measurements that they're taking is, did her husband come with her to the clinic? Yes, perfect, then he's a supportive husband. And if not, he's not. And she said, this doesn't make any sense to me because my husband works, for example. She was reflecting on her own life, saying that my husband works. He won't leave his his workday because he won't be able to take time off to come with me. This doesn't mean that the decision wasn't made together. This doesn't mean that I'm not satisfied. Or maybe I just don't want him there because I make these decisions on myself. So it's not really a good representation of what joint decision making is if you check these specific questions or boxes. So I think there's a lot of obstacles, and it's going to take a long time to come up with what is autonomy and what is satisfaction. There have been a lot of talks about method dissatisfaction and what that means, and just, breaking it up a little bit. Even joint decision making, I was in a talk yesterday, and they even talked about some of the obstacles they face, because they found out when they did a qualitative research that when the husband says, don't use contraception, the wife reports that this was a joint decision making, even though she'd had no say in it. But because it was said by the husband, then she considered it a joint decision. So again, like even when you come up with specific measurements, you need to go deeper into it. I don't have the answer of what's the best one, but I hope that the experts will come up with newer ones. Your question was similar, wasn't it? I'm really sorry. So I hope that answers it. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? We still have a lot of time left, so any other burning questions? You have another one? Sure.
Thank you. It's me again, but this time the question won't be that complicated. I can assure you. So you were talking about decolonization in family planning. I try to understand, but since we have time, I wish to hear more about it, and if you can contextualize it a bit so that we can all understand what you really mean. I think that is what I wish to ask as a follow-up question. But otherwise, I quite appreciate what you responded to my earlier question. I think it's a journey. We all need to capture those stories behind the numbers, the quantitative indicators. So decolonization, please. Thanks.
It's the it word now. Yes. How do you even define it? You keep giving me the difficult questions. Okay, so I did my PhD in London, and it was the new it topic to talk about decolonizing global health and decolonizing sexual health, and thinking about the colonial influences on the countries that were previously colonized by the West, and seeing how the views of these, especially funding agencies and academic agencies on the ground, and trying to understand the local context and respect it. And so this whole topic of decolonizing is to have these open, safe spaces to try and see how the colonial powers impacted practice on the ground. It's very interesting for me coming from Saudi, because Saudi Arabia was never colonized formally by, or officially, by any Western power. Yet I always tell people that I feel like we are intellectually colonized, especially by American educational systems and healthcare systems, because we try to emulate that. And so for me, it's also an interesting thing that we keep focusing on previously colonized countries without really taking into account how influential textbooks even are in different countries, and how we perceive medicine. I studied medicine, for example. A lot of the times we study from American books, telling us that, oh, these specific diseases are more prevalent in African American communities. And then naively, as young Saudi students, when we would have a black Saudi patient, we would assume that this affects them in the same way, not taking the differences into account. And I think for me, decolonizing means challenging that as well. So I have also kind of like a unique perspective when it comes to decolonizing. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much. Last call for questions. Oh, we have a question in the back. Okay.
Thank you. Hi, can you hear me? Sorry, this isn't a question. I did have some that others asked, so thank you for that, and thank you both for your presentations. The question around, are there new indicators that people are considering? Thank you for telling us about Lisa and Derowitz. This is a plug for our presentation tomorrow. My name is Jessica Deneau. This is Christine Dellendorf, Kelsey Holt from UCSF, and Elizabeth Harrington from University of Washington will also be presenting. But essentially, we're talking about that. What new indicators are people working towards developing, including what sexual and reproductive well-being means, preference-aligned fertility management, and sexual and reproductive empowerment. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that tomorrow at 10:15 if anyone is interested. Thank you.
Great. And which room is that in?
I think it's in Pattaya 17.
All right. It's in Pattaya 17 at 10:15.
Nice.
All right. I just want to thank our panelists for their presentations. And if there are no other questions, I think I'll give you back 25 minutes before the lunch.